These are some of the kitting supplies that you would need. So first of all, a baby monitor is incredibly important. I just was talking to somebody yesterday. She set her alarm for every 2 hours to go out to the barn, and she's been doing this for days. So that is not sustainable for a human. Not only that, but their chances are very good that you are going to miss a birth if you do that, because some goats will be very stoic until the head is coming out. So even having a baby monitor, I cannot tell you how many times I have been sleeping soundly and got woke up by a goat screaming. And by the time I get to the barn, there's a kid already there. It doesn't happen every time because every goat's different, but it has happened more times than I can count. I mean, dozens of times that a goat does not make a sound until she's that close to actually giving birth. And when I say baby monitor, I just mean a cheap $15 or $20 monitor from the discount store. When I was getting started, I went to Walmart because that was the only store we had in our little town. And I thought, all right, I'm going to start with the cheapest monitor and I'm going to be very careful when I unpackage it. So if it doesn't work, I can return it. And then I will buy the next least expensive monitor. I was like, there's no point in buying an expensive monitor if I don't need it. So I started with the $15 monitor. This was in the early 2000s. And it wouldn't go through the metal walls of our barn. So we put it in the window and then we put the receiver in the window of our house, and that worked. And so that helped us make sure that we were there. Lots of kittings that we would have otherwise missed, which is really important, especially if your temperatures are really low. A lot of the videos that you'll see in the course, like the kids are born and there'll be steam rising off of them because a lot of those births took place in February in Illinois and it is freezing, like way below freezing. I think there are some in there that are sub-zero. The second most important thing are towels. You really do need towels. And people say, well, doesn't the mother lick them? Yes, she does, but she's not going to get them dry. And if it's 70 degrees out, then it's not important. Like they'll just air dry, because it's 70 degrees. But the colder it is, the slower liquid evaporates. And once you're below zero, liquid does not evaporate, it freezes. And so then you're going to have a freeze-dried kid. And so you've got to have towels to get as much off as you can. And the colder it is, the more important it is to have a blow dryer. I didn't actually use a blow dryer until we had our first below zero kitting. And then after that, I've used it at warmer and warmer temperatures. And now I'm kind of like, it's below freezing. Let's grab the blow dryer, because the kids are up and on their feet and nursing so much faster once they're dry and warm. So that's really important. And they have hypothermia if you put your finger in their mouth and it's cold. It should be warm inside their mouth. I also have a heating pad, and the heating pad is much for me as it is for the kids. Basically, if it's really cold out, I am sitting on the ground with the heating pad plugged in and in my lap. And so it's keeping my legs warm. And then I put a towel on top of the heating pad and I put the kids in my lap while I'm blow drying them. So the part that's laying on the heating pad is nice and warm, and then they're being blow dried. So they'll get super warm and dry quickly. So then they'll start nursing more quickly and guaranteed to have a better outcome. Heat lamps are very, very dangerous. They are the #1 cause of barn fires. So please do not use a heat lamp unless you absolutely have to have it. I get a lot of people saying, my doe's been in labor for 2 days. What should I do? And when they say that, a lot of times I will say, can you send me just a short video clip of what has you concerned? Like, what are you seeing that makes you think she's in labor? And a lot of times, it can be 50 degrees and I will see a heat lamp behind the doe. And that is a completely unnecessary risk. So you don't need a heat lamp unless it's freezing. The next thing is the Pritchard teat and bottle. So you can buy these teats with bottles, which is cool because those bottles have markings on them. These teats will go on soda bottles. So you notice how the collar on this is pretty high. It does not work on most water bottles these days because most water bottles have threads that are so tiny that if you put this on there, it is going to leak like crazy. Like milk is just going to be pouring out under where you screw it on. So don't try to use it with a water bottle unless it's one of the really fancy, expensive bottled waters that's got a great big area that you can screw this onto. And on the left is a real Pritchard Teat, which is latex. On the right is a knockoff, which is plastic. And I really prefer the ones on the left. They work much better. There's a video in the kitting course that specifically shows you how to cut these. You do not need to cut a vertical slit in it. I have never done that. And I don't know why everybody thinks you have to now. On the Premier One website, it says that if you're using it with a bottle, you cut that thing off. If you're using it with a lamb bar or a bucket feeder, then you slice it. That's why I've cut them off forever and it works completely fine. And it's way easier than trying to put a slice it. You need a razor, a very, very sharp razor if you want to slice it. Another thing it's a good idea to have is a bulb syringe. And it says, store in a warm place. These do not like freezing temperatures. I used my baby's bulb syringe for years after I started raising goats until one day I had left it in the barn and it was so cold. And when I went to use it, you depress that bulb before you stick it in the baby's nose. When I depressed it, it just cracked because it was so cold. So you need to store it in a warm place. I basically keep one in the pocket of my coat. The first one I bought after the one that my children had was one that I forgot in the barn one day. And when I came back out there, it had fallen off the shelf and fallen into a kidding pen, and the dough had chewed off this whole section here. So it was completely worthless. So I had to order more. So I think I ordered 3 of those, and I have them strategically placed around the farm, like in the storeroom and in the coat closet of the house. And I always try to keep one in the pocket of my coat during kidding season. And you only need to use that if a kid is all gurgly and it sounds like they're all mucusy and they're not sneezing and screaming. Most of them come out sneezing and screaming, so you don't even need to use this. I don't think I've used ours in, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 years, maybe longer. The next item on the list is iodine. I only use that to squirt on disposable gloves if I am going to put my hand inside of a dough to check on the position of a kid. And that's basically just to do my best to disinfect that glove, even though we're in a very non-sterile environment, to try and prevent uterine infection in the dough. Some people dip umbilical cords in it. You can if you want. The research on this is actually mixed. It is not as clear cut as some people say. There are studies that show that it either makes no difference or that it's actually you can have worse outcomes, which I find interesting. So if you use iodine, I think maybe some of the research that was done that showed negative outcomes it was done a long time ago when iodine was much, much stronger than it is now. Legitimate 7% iodine is no longer legal to sell because it's used in crystal meth production. I know you see stuff in the store now that says 10%, but if you turn the bottle around, it actually says 1% active iodine. And the highest I've ever been able to find anywhere is 2%. So the legitimate 7% iodine that all of us used to use back when I got started, you can't buy it anymore. The cord will break 99% of the time when the kid is born. If it doesn't, you can cut it with scissors or you can tear it. If you tear it, make sure that you have it wrapped around your fingers next to the umbilicus, because you don't want to accidentally rip it out of the umbilicus, because you don't want to have an open wound right there on the kid's belly. It's like tearing a piece of yarn. So if you feel comfortable tearing a piece of yarn, then you totally know what I'm talking about. You want to make sure that you've got 2 or 3 inches that's still attached to the kid. If you use scissors to cut it, then you should probably put some iodine on that, because your scissors are definitely not sterile if they're in the barn and you're putting them into that cord. So probably a good idea. You really, really need to have disposable gloves. So you need them if you're unsure of your goat's disease status. So if your goat might have some kind of a disease that is zoonotic that you could catch, then you definitely want to be wearing gloves. Even if you don't put your hand inside the dough, when the kid's born, it's completely covered with birth goo from the inside of this goat's uterus. So you definitely don't want to have some zoonotic disease all over your hands, because the next thing you know, you're like scratching your nose or rubbing your eye or whatever and getting yourself infected. If you are pregnant, this is even more important, or if there's any chance you could be pregnant, because some of these zoonotic diseases can cause problems with pregnant women and with their babies. If you have a cut on your hand, you also really need to have gloves on so that your cut does not get infected. It's not true that you can't get an infection from your animals. You see this sometimes on social media. People say that, oh, you're used to your animal's germs. Well, nobody ever gets used to germs like Campylobacter and chlamydia and toxoplasmosis and things like that. That's why you need to be wearing gloves so that you don't give yourself one of those horrible diseases. It's worth it to have a feeding tube and a 60cc syringe just in case. Honestly, the last time I used this, there's a video in the course that shows me using this, and I have not had to use it since then. Before that, it was at least 5 years. The biggest thing I have learned about tube feeding kids is that usually the reason they're not sucking is because they have hypothermia. And so if you get them warmed up, you're golden. In fact, one time we had a kidding that happened. It was 15 below zero. And thank goodness that goat went into labor when she did, because when we went running into the barn, we found this little kid that had been born the day before. She was laying in the middle of the straw. She was not under the heat lamp, cuddled up with her siblings. And we had an intern here at the time. And I said, okay, you know what to do with Agnes. You stay with her. I'm going to run this kid inside. So I ran that kid into the house. It's like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I ran that kid into the house, into the bedroom, and my husband is sleeping soundly. And I said, this kid has hypothermia. I'm sticking her in bed with you. I'll be back when Agnes is finished kidding. And this kid was as limp as could be. She could not stand up. She had no muscle tone. And in my head, I was thinking, I'm probably going to have to tube feed her. Hopefully she survives until Agnes is through kidding, because it's 15 below zero and Agnes's babies really need us right now. And so a couple hours later, I come back and that little doe was completely in amazing shape. She's like, happy, happy. So I got a bottle of milk and I fed her. That was like one of the very last times that I ever left 4 kids with a doe, because she almost starved to death in that first day. So when it's really cold like that, it's even more important for them to make sure that they're getting plenty of milk. The last thing that I have listed there is a calcium drench. And this talked about quite a bit in the pregnancy video where I talked about hypocalcemia. So that is why you would have a calcium drench available. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about are kid coats. Like heat lamps, these should only be used when absolutely necessary, because it is possible for kids to get hung up on these coats and wind up injured or dead. And that actually happened on our farm. We had a doe. Basically, what happened, we went out and we found her dragging around a kid. Her leg had gone in the neck and out the leg of the coat. So the kid was trapped. It had nowhere to go. And the goat couldn't lay down without laying on the kid. So the kid wound up dead because it was wearing a coat like this. So I've made these out of the sleeve of a sweatshirt. And so now that I've told you that, you're probably like, oh yeah, that's the wristband of the sweatshirt. And then you cut it so that the seam goes under the belly, and then you just need a couple of holes for the 2 front legs. And then especially if a kid is a boy, you want to make sure that this comes far enough forward, because otherwise, the first time I did one of these and put it on a boy, it wound up soaking wet, the first time he peed. Just always cut them so that they come way in, so that they won't be covering their penis. When they pee, they need to be able to not hit this, because otherwise it's not doing them any good. And then you can see this is what it looks like when it's on these kids. And these kids were very, very small. These kids were less than 2 pounds, and it was very cold. So how do you know if a kid is having trouble maintaining its body temperature? Basically, you go in there and they're cold. So like that one little doe that, I wound up warming up by sticking it in bed with my husband. If you weigh them and they have not gained weight, and then you stick your finger in their mouth and they're cold, that's a bad sign. Now, normally we weigh them every 24 hours for the first couple of weeks after they're born. Like, especially if it's really cold or we have any concerns whatsoever, we will weigh a kid 12 hours after it was born, and then again 24 hours. And then we put them onto the regular schedule of just like weighing all the kids every evening if they are less than 2 weeks old, to make sure everyone is gaining weight well.